Admiral Thomas Whitaker had commanded fleets and earned medals that covered half his chest. But on a scorching Virginia afternoon, a 10-year-old black girl made him a bet that would unravel 5 years of buried secrets. She claimed she could start an aircraft carrier, and when officers laughed, she pulled out a Naval Academy ring engraved with a name he'd spent years trying to forget. Amira Johnson was the daughter of the engineer whose warnings he'd ignored, the hero who died saving his life. And now, with her mother's determination burning in her eyes, she was about to force him to face a truth that would either destroy his career or finally set them both free. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The Virginia sun beat down on Norfolk Naval Base with relentless intensity, turning the steel deck of the massive aircraft carrier into a shimmering mirror of heat. The air shimmered above the metal surfaces, creating wavy distortions that made the horizon dance. Seagulls circled overhead, their cries mixing with the sounds of machinery and barked orders. The smell of salt water mingled with diesel fuel and hot metal, creating the distinctive scent that marked every naval installation along the coast. Sailors moved with practiced efficiency across the ship, their white uniforms crisp against the gray metal, preparing for the afternoon's public exhibition. They called to each other in the shorthand language of career military personnel, checking equipment, securing lines, and ensuring everything was perfect for the day's demonstration. Families and visitors would soon flood the base, eager to glimpse the pride of the Atlantic Fleet. Tour groups were already forming near the main entrance, parents holding tight to excited children, veterans pointing out features to their grandchildren. Among the growing crowd near the visitors' checkpoint stood a small figure who seemed out of place among the bustling military personnel. She was quieter than the other children, more focused. While other kids bounced with energy and chattered excitedly, this girl simply watched, absorbed every detail with an intensity unusual for someone her age. Amira Johnson was 10 years old, her dark eyes taking in every detail of the enormous vessel before her. Those eyes missed nothing, tracking the movement of crew members, following the paths of cables and equipment, noting the way the sunlight caught the carrier's superstructure. She clutched a weathered Navy cap in her small hands, the fabric faded from years of careful handling. The cap had belonged to her mother, and Amira never went anywhere important without it. Today felt important. Today felt like the most important day of her life. She slipped past the main crowd, drawn toward the ship like iron to a magnet. The other visitors were content to stay behind the ropes, snapping photos and pointing at the aircraft lined up on the deck. But Amira wanted more than pictures. She wanted to understand. She wanted to feel what her mother had felt walking these same decks years ago. The restricted area signs barely registered in her mind as she ducked under a rope barrier and headed toward a metal staircase leading up to the command deck. Her sneakers made soft sounds against the steps, and her heart hammered with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. She knew she probably wasn't supposed to be here, but something pulled her forward. "Excuse me, young lady." The voice was sharp, authoritative, cutting through the ambient noise of the base like a blade. Amira froze, one hand on the railing. She turned slowly to find a tall white man in an officer's uniform standing a few feet away, his arms crossed over his chest. His gray hair was cut military short, and his face bore the weathered lines of someone who'd spent years at sea. The stars on his collar marked him as someone important. Very important. Admiral Thomas Whitaker had been conducting a final inspection before the exhibition when he spotted the small girl wandering where she absolutely should not be. His first instinct was annoyance. Security was supposed to be tight during these events. But as he approached her, something about the way she held herself, confident despite being caught, made him pause. "Who are you looking for?" he asked, his tone slightly less harsh. Amira met his gaze without flinching. I'm not looking for anyone, sir. I want to see how my mom's ship runs. Whitaker's eyebrows rose. Your mom's ship? He glanced at the cap in her hands, noting the faded Navy insignia. Probably bought at the gift shop, he thought. This is a restricted area. You need to be with the other visitors. But I need to see the command deck, Amira insisted, her voice gaining strength. My mom worked on carriers like this. She was an engineer. She told me all about how the systems work, how everything connects. I just want to see it. The Admiral couldn't help the slight smile that tugged at his lips. The girl had spirit, he'd give her that. That's cute, really. But naval engineering isn't something a child can understand. It's complicated, dangerous, and definitely not a place for curiosity. I understand more than you think, Amira said quietly. Something in her voice made Whitaker study her more carefully. There was a determination in those young eyes that went beyond childish stubbornness. It reminded him of someone, though he couldn't quite place who. Oh, really? He decided to humor her. And what exactly do you think you understand? Amira took a breath. I know this carrier has nuclear reactors that power the propulsion system. I know there are backup generators and auxiliary power grids. I know the command deck controls everything from navigation to weapon systems, and that there are redundant safety protocols in case anything fails. The Admiral's smile faded. That was more than gift shop knowledge. Someone's been doing their homework. My mom taught me, Amira said simply, before she died. The words hung in the air between them. Whitaker felt a twinge of something uncomfortable in his chest. He'd lost good people over the years, too many to count. But something about this girl's quiet grief struck a chord. Before he could respond, Amira reached into her pocket and pulled out a small metal ring. It was too large for her fingers, clearly meant for an adult hand. Even from a few feet away, Whitaker could see the engraving on its surface, the unmistakable crest of the Naval Academy. His blood went cold. Where did you get that? The question came out more sharply than he intended. It was my mom's, Amira said, holding it up. She got it when she graduated from the academy. She told me to keep it safe, that one day I'd understand what it meant. Whitaker stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the ring. Naval Academy rings weren't souvenirs. They were earned through 4 years of grueling training and study. They represented a commitment to service that went beyond words. If this girl's mother had been academy trained, she'd been a true officer. And if she'd died in service. He forced himself to laugh, though it sounded hollow, even to his own ears. That's quite a souvenir. But academy rings are earned, not given to children to play with. I'm not playing, Amira said, her voice steady despite the hurt in her eyes. And I could prove it. I could start this carrier's auxiliary system right now if you let me. The declaration was so bold, so utterly absurd, that several nearby officers who'd been pretending not to listen actually turned to stare. One of them, a young lieutenant, chuckled openly. Did she just say she could start the carrier? Another officer whispered. Whitaker should have ended it right there. He should have called security, had the girl escorted back to the visitors area, and continued with his day. But something about her absolute conviction, the way she held that ring like it was a sacred trust, made him pause. An idea formed in his mind. A terrible, probably inappropriate idea. But he was curious now, and if he was honest with himself, a little impressed by her confidence. All right, he said slowly. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to make you a bet. Amira's eyes widened slightly, but she said nothing, waiting. If you can start one system on this carrier, just one, I'll give you a full tour. You can see everything your heart desires. But if you can't, you apologize for wasting everyone's time and go back to playing sailor somewhere else. The other officers exchanged glances. This was highly irregular, but the Admiral was known for his unconventional methods, and no one was going to question him. Amira considered the offer for only a moment before nodding. "Deal. Tomorrow morning," Whitaker said. 0800 hours. Don't be late." As Amira turned to leave, escorted by a bemused ensign, Whitaker watched her go. One of his officers stepped up beside him, a worried expression on his face. "Sir, maybe we shouldn't—" "Relax," Whitaker interrupted, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "She's just a kid." But even as he said it, he couldn't shake the image of that Naval Academy ring from his mind. That evening, Amira sat cross-legged on the worn carpet of her grandmother's living room, staring at the framed photograph on the mantel. The room was dimly lit by a single lamp, casting long shadows across the collection of family photos that documented a lifetime of memories. The furniture was old but comfortable, pieces that had witnessed births and deaths, celebrations and sorrows. The faint smell of the dinner her grandmother had tried to coax her to eat still lingered in the air. Her mother smiled out from the picture, proud in her dress uniform. Lieutenant Commander Naomi Johnson had been beautiful, brilliant, and brave. Her smile was confident but warm, the kind of smile that could make you feel like everything would be okay, even when it wasn't. The photograph had been taken at her promotion ceremony, and if you looked closely, you could see the pride shining in her eyes. And she'd been gone for 5 years. 5 years of birthdays without her. 5 years of school events with an empty chair. 5 years of questions that no one would answer. "You're thinking too hard again, baby," her grandmother said from the doorway, her voice soft with concern. Amira didn't look away from the photo. "Grandma, tell me again about Mom's last mission." The old woman sighed, settling into her armchair with a slight groan. She was tired, had been tired for years, carrying the weight of raising a granddaughter alone while mourning her own daughter. "We've been through this, Amira. Your mama was on a classified mission. I don't know the details, and even if I did, I couldn't tell you. All I know is she was doing important work, and she died serving her country. But you know more than that," Amira pressed. "I've heard you talking to Aunt Keisha. I've heard you say something went wrong, that someone made a mistake." Her grandmother's face tightened. "Child, you need to let this go. Your mama wouldn't want you stirring up trouble with those Navy men. They got their own ways, their own rules. You can't change what happened." "But I can understand it," Amira said quietly. "Mom always said understanding was the first step to everything. That's why she taught me about the ships, about the systems. She wanted me to understand her world." "She wanted you to be educated," her grandmother corrected, "not to go poking around naval bases making bets with admirals." Amira finally turned to look at her. "How did you?" "The base called. That nice ensign wanted to make sure you got home safe and that we knew about tomorrow's demonstration." The word was laden with disapproval. "Amira, what were you thinking?" "I was thinking Mom would want me to do this," Amira said, simply. "She left me her ring for a reason, Grandma, and tomorrow I'm going to find out why." Her grandmother opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. She saw too much of Naomi in Amira's stubborn expression, heard too much of her daughter's determination in her granddaughter's voice. Some battles couldn't be won. "Just be careful," she finally said, "and come home safe." After her grandmother went to bed, Amira remained in the living room studying the photograph. She didn't notice when the frame tilted slightly, revealing the edge of a dusty envelope tucked behind it. The envelope was marked with official stamps and the words, "Classified, Project Seahawk," in faded red letters. Inside was a letter addressed to Amira, written in her mother's careful handwriting. But Amira never saw it that night. She was too focused on tomorrow, on the challenge ahead, on proving that she was her mother's daughter in every way that mattered. Across the base, in the officers' club, whispers had already begun to spread. Sailors had a way of gossiping that put any small town to shame, and the story of the little girl who'd challenged the Admiral had traveled fast. "I heard she knew technical specs," one petty officer said over his beer. "Probably looked them up online." Another responded, "Kids these days can find anything on the internet." But in a quiet corner, an older chief sat nursing his drink, his face troubled. He'd been at the base long enough to remember Operation Seahawk. He remembered Lieutenant Commander Naomi Johnson, and he remembered what had happened on that God-forsaken mission. Admiral Whitaker led that operation, he muttered to himself, and it still haunts him. Always will. No one heard him. No one asked. Some stories were better left buried. But as Amira drifted off to sleep that night, clutching her mother's cap, and as Admiral Whitaker stared at his ceiling, unable to rest, both of them knew that tomorrow would change everything. The past had a way of demanding to be acknowledged, and the truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how deep you tried to bury it. The ship that had started it all waited in the harbor, silent and patient, holding secrets in its steel heart. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that Virginia summers sometimes offered before the heat became unbearable. Amira had barely slept, rising before dawn to dress carefully in jeans and a t-shirt. She placed her mother's cap on her head, adjusting it until it sat just right, then slipped the Naval Academy ring onto a chain around her neck. It was too precious to risk losing. Her grandmother was already in the kitchen making breakfast neither of them would eat. "You sure about this?" the old woman asked one more time. Amira nodded, unable to speak past the nervous lump in her throat. "Then you better get going. It's a long bus ride to the base." By 7:45, Amira was standing at the visitors' checkpoint where the same ensign from yesterday waited to escort her. He looked uncomfortable, as if he'd drawn the short straw and was stuck with babysitting duty. "Right this way, miss," he said formally, leading her through security and across the base. The carrier loomed larger in the morning light, its presence somehow more imposing than it had been yesterday. As they climbed the gangway, Amira could see sailors pausing in their work to watch her. Some looked amused, others looked curious. A few looked almost sympathetic. The command bay was a revelation. Banks of monitors and control panels lined the walls, each one displaying streams of data that would have been meaningless to most civilians. But Amira's eyes tracked across them hungrily, recognizing systems her mother had described during late-night talks when Amira was supposed to be sleeping. Admiral Whitaker stood in the center of the room, arms folded across his chest, surrounded by several senior officers. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp, assessing. 8 o'clock on the dot, he said. "I'm impressed you showed up." "I said I would," Amira replied simply. One of the officers, a burly commander with a reddish face, chuckled. "This should be entertaining. What do we call her, junior engineer Barbie?" A few nervous laughs rippled through the room. Amira felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she refused to look away from the Admiral. Whitaker shot the commander a warning glance before turning back to Amira. "The rules are simple. You get one attempt to activate a system, any system. You have 10 minutes. If nothing happens, you apologize and leave. Understood?" "Yes, sir." "Then begin." The room fell silent except for the ambient hum of electronics. Amira stepped forward, her eyes scanning the control panels. She could feel every gaze on her, heavy with skepticism and barely concealed mockery. Her hands trembled slightly as she moved along the console. "My mom showed me this." "Kind of," she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. "Sure she did," someone whispered, not quite under their breath. Amira blocked out the voices, focusing on what she knew. Her mother had described the layout of carrier control systems dozens of times. The main power grid would be too dangerous to touch. But there were auxiliary systems, diagnostic modes designed for maintenance and testing. Then she saw it. A secondary circuit panel, slightly ajar, tucked beneath one of the primary consoles. She knelt down, examining it closely. "Why is the emergency auxiliary grid disconnected?" she asked, looking up at the Admiral. The room went very quiet. Whitaker's eyebrows lifted almost imperceptibly. That panel shouldn't be noticeable to anyone who wasn't an engineer. The fact that she'd not only spotted it but identified its function was disturbing. "Routine maintenance," he said carefully. "Why?" "Because if it's disconnected, the diagnostic system won't show full readiness," Amira explained. "But it also means I can run a safe test sequence without engaging any primary systems." She was right. Whitaker exchanged glances with his chief engineer, who gave a small, surprised nod. "All right," the Admiral said slowly. "Show us." Amira's fingers moved across the panel with a confidence that belied her age. She'd watched her mother's hands do the same dance on similar systems, had memorized every movement even when she didn't fully understand the purpose. "I'm going to use diagnostic mode," she explained as she worked. "Not full ignition. This will verify the connection and power flow without actually starting anything dangerous." She pressed a sequence of buttons, her small fingers finding each one with deliberate care. For a moment, nothing happened. The officers began to shift, some already smirking. Then the alarms flickered. Just briefly. Just a warning chirp. Everyone held their breath. Silence stretched like a rubber band about to snap. Then, deep in the belly of the ship, something responded. One of the auxiliary turbines hummed to life, its sound faint but unmistakable. The deck vibrated slightly underfoot, a subtle tremor that every experienced sailor recognized immediately. "Holy!" someone started to say. The monitor above the auxiliary grid flashed green. Power flow confirmed. System ready. The room erupted in whispered exclamations. Officers crowded around the monitors, checking readings, confirming what their instruments were telling them. It wasn't possible. A 10-year-old child had just activated a carrier turbine. Admiral Whitaker stepped forward, his face drained of color. "Who taught you that sequence?" Amira turned to face him, and for the first time since entering the room, her composure cracked. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "My mom," she said softly. "Lieutenant Commander Naomi Johnson, before you took her on that mission." The name dropped into the silence like a stone into still water, sending ripples through everyone present. Several officers straightened unconsciously. The chief engineer's face went pale, and Admiral Whitaker looked as if he'd been struck. "Johnson," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Naomi Johnson. She died 5 years ago," Amira continued, her voice growing stronger even as tears began to slip down her cheeks. "On Operation Seahawk, you were the commanding officer, and she never came home." The Admiral's jaw worked, but no sound came out. The weight of every gaze in the room shifted from Amira to him, waiting for a response, for an explanation. "That ring should have never left the Academy," he finally said, his voice rough. It was the wrong thing to say. Amira's face crumpled with hurt and anger. It was hers. She earned it, and she left it for me because she knew something would happen to her. "Amira," Whitaker started, then stopped, unsure what to say. "How do you explain to a child that her mother had been right to warn against an experimental engine test? How do you admit that you'd overruled her concerns? How do you confess that you've carried that guilt for 5 years? "Shut it down," he ordered instead, his voice hard. "Demonstration's over." "Sir, shouldn't we?" one of the officers began. "I said shut it down." Whitaker's voice cracked like a whip. The auxiliary turbine wound down, its hum fading to silence. The deck stopped vibrating. The moment of impossible achievement vanished as if it had never happened. Amira stood frozen, tears streaming down her face, Her mother's cap clutched in one hand and the Naval Academy ring burning against her chest. She'd done it. She'd proven herself. But somehow, it felt like losing. The Admiral turned away from her, his shoulders rigid. "Lieutenant," he said to the ensign who'd escorted Amira. "See her off the base." "Sir." "Now." As the ensign gently took Amira's arm to lead her away, she looked back at the Admiral one last time. In that moment, she saw past his stern expression to the pain underneath. He was hiding something. Something about her mother. Something about that mission. And she was going to find out what. The door to the command bay closed behind her with a hollow clang, sealing her off from the murmured conversations that immediately erupted inside. The officers would talk. They would question. They would remember. And somewhere in the base's archives, buried under layers of classification and time, Operation Seahawk's files waited to tell their story. The ship had yielded its first secret. Many more remained hidden in its steel heart, waiting for someone brave enough, or perhaps reckless enough to uncover them. Amira walked across the deck with her head high despite her tears. Her mother had taught her that. Walk with dignity, even when you're scared. Show them you belong, even when they try to push you out. Behind her, in the command bay, Admiral Thomas Whitaker stared at the now dark auxiliary panel and felt the full weight of his past pressing down on him. Naomi Johnson's daughter. Of course. The girl had her mother's eyes, her mother's determination, her mother's gift for engineering. And now she had her mother's questions. He'd thought those questions were buried. He'd thought he could carry his guilt quietly, privately, until retirement finally released him from service and memory alike. But the past, it seemed, had other plans. "Sir," his chief engineer said quietly, stepping up beside him. "That sequence she used, that was Commander Johnson's modification, the one she proposed before the Seahawk mission." "I know," Whitaker said heavily. "Sir, if that girl figured it out, she didn't figure it out," Whitaker interrupted. "She was taught. Deliberately. Naomi knew. She knew something would go wrong, and she prepared her daughter." The implications of that hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Outside, morning turned to afternoon, and the public exhibition continued as planned. Families toured the carrier, took photos, listened to rehearsed presentations about naval power and American strength. Children posed beside massive cannons. Veterans shared stories with active-duty sailors. Tour guides explained the ship's history and capabilities in voices practiced from repetition. None of them knew what had happened in the command bay that morning. None of them understood that history had been made, that a small girl had done the impossible. None of them would ever know the truth about Operation Seahawk, or the brilliant engineer who'd sacrificed everything. But Amira knew. And she would not forget. She would carry this moment with her, fuel it into determination, let it guide her toward the truth. Her mother had left her more than a ring and a cap. She'd left her a legacy, a mystery, and the tools to solve it. The bet had been won. The turbine had hummed to life. The impossible had become real. But the real challenge was just beginning, because winning the bet had opened doors that some people wanted to keep closed. It had asked questions that some people didn't want answered, and it had awakened a past that refused to stay buried any longer. Admiral Whitaker would learn that truth couldn't be ordered away like a subordinate. Amira would learn that courage sometimes meant facing answers you weren't ready for. And the carrier, that massive vessel of steel and secrets, would become the stage where past and present collided in ways no one could have predicted. The dismissal from the command bay stung worse than Amira expected. She'd won the bet, proven herself capable, yet somehow it felt hollow. The ensign who escorted her off the base was kind enough, offering gentle words about how impressive her demonstration had been. But Amira barely heard him. Her mind was elsewhere, replaying the look on Admiral Whitaker's face when she'd spoken her mother's name. That wasn't just surprise. That was recognition. That was guilt. The bus ride home felt longer than usual, every stop dragging out the journey. By the time Amira walked through her grandmother's front door, the afternoon sun was painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Her grandmother took one look at her face and pulled her into a tight embrace, asking no questions, simply offering comfort. But comfort wasn't what Amira needed. She needed answers. That night, unable to sleep, she crept back into the living room and stood before her mother's photograph. In the dim light, Naomi's smile seemed sadder somehow, as if she'd known the pain her absence would cause. Amira reached up to adjust the frame, and that's when she felt it give slightly in her hands. The backing was loose. Her heart racing, Amira carefully removed the photograph from the frame. Behind it, wedged into the narrow space, was a dusty envelope. Her fingers trembled as she pulled it free. The envelope was marked with official stamps and warnings, the words "Classified," "Project Seahawk," printed in faded red letters across the front. And beneath that, in her mother's handwriting, "For Amira." Amira's breath caught in her throat. She glanced toward the hallway, listening for any sound of her grandmother stirring. But the house remained silent. With careful fingers, she opened the envelope and found several pages covered in her mother's neat handwriting, along with technical drawings and what looked like coordinates. The letter began simply, "My dearest Amira, if you're reading this, it means I didn't come home. I'm so sorry, baby. But I need you to know the truth." Tears blurred Amira's vision, but she forced herself to keep reading. Her mother explained Project Seahawk in terms that a child could understand, describing it as an attempt to create a new kind of ship engine that would be faster and more efficient than anything the Navy had ever built. But there had been problems with the design, flaws that Naomi had identified and reported. "I told Admiral Whitaker that the prototype wasn't stable," the letter continued. "I showed him the calculations, explained the risks. But there was pressure from above, deadlines to meet, careers on the line. He ordered the test anyway. I tried to stop it, Amira. I tried so hard. But when the engine started failing, I was the only one who knew how to contain it. I stayed behind so the rest of the crew could evacuate. I stayed behind so Tom Whitaker could live." The words struck Amira like a physical blow. Her mother had saved the Admiral's life. She'd sacrificed herself to protect him and the others, even though he'd ignored her warnings. The unfairness of it, the tragedy, filled Amira with a rage so intense she had to press her hand over her mouth to keep from crying out. But there was more. The letter included coordinates, technical specifications, and a final message. "The engine design was my life's work, even with its flaws. I've hidden the corrected schematics in my old locker on the base, locker 247 in the engineering section. If someone ever questions what happened, if the truth needs to come out, you'll find it there. I love you, my brilliant girl. Make them remember that we tried to do it right." Amira carefully folded the letter and tucked it back into the envelope. Her hands shook, but her resolve hardened. She knew what she had to do. She had to get back on that base. She had to find her mother's locker. She had to recover the proof that would show the world what really happened. But how? She'd been escorted off the base with clear instructions not to return without authorization. Security wouldn't let her through again, and she certainly couldn't ask Admiral Whitaker for help. She needed an ally, someone inside who understood, someone who might believe her. Then she remembered the kind look in Lieutenant Perez's eyes. He'd been watching during her demonstration, and unlike the others, he hadn't laughed or mocked. He'd looked impressed, even moved. It wasn't much to go on, but it was all she had. The next morning, Amira told her grandmother she was going to the library. It wasn't entirely a lie, since she planned to use the library's computer to research the base's layout and find a way to contact Lieutenant Perez. What she didn't mention was that she had no intention of staying at the library. Meanwhile, across the city in his office, Admiral Thomas Whitaker was having the worst morning of his career. The locked drawer in his desk stood open, and spread across his desk were the contents of a case file he'd hoped never to review again. Operation Seahawk stared back at him in stark black and white photographs, incident reports, and witness statements. He picked up a photo of the crew before the mission. Naomi Johnson stood in the front row, her smile confident, her posture radiating competence. She'd been one of the best engineers he'd ever worked with, and he'd gotten her killed. Not directly, not with his own hands, but through his arrogance, his refusal to listen, his belief that military hierarchy trumped technical expertise. "You were right," he whispered to the photograph. "About everything." A knock on his door made him quickly gather the papers. "Enter." Lieutenant Perez stepped inside, his expression troubled. "Sir, I apologize for the intrusion, but I need to speak with you about yesterday." Whitaker felt his jaw tighten. "The matter is closed, Lieutenant." "With respect, sir, I don't think it is." Perez remained standing at attention, but his voice was firm. "That girl knew things she shouldn't have known. The sequence she used, the way she identified that auxiliary panel, those aren't things you learn from stories. Commander Johnson must have deliberately trained her." "What's your point?" Whitaker asked, though he already knew. "My point is that maybe Commander Johnson wanted someone to know the truth. Maybe she left information behind, and that little girl is trying to find it." Perez paused, then added quietly, "And maybe we should help her instead of shutting her out." The Admiral leaned back in his chair, studying the young officer. Perez had only been on his crew for 2 years, but he'd proven himself reliable and, more importantly, possessed of a conscience that Whitaker sometimes envied. Helping her would mean reopening an investigation that was closed years ago, Whitaker said slowly. It would mean questioning decisions made by people far above both our pay grades. It would mean potentially destroying careers, including mine. "Yes, sir," Perez agreed. "But it might also mean giving Commander Johnson the recognition she deserves, and giving her daughter closure." Whitaker was silent for a long moment, the weight of 5 years of guilt pressing down on him. Finally, he said, "If you were going to help that girl, hypothetically, what would you do?" Perez allowed himself a small smile. "Hypothetically, sir, I'd start by finding out what she's looking for." They didn't have to wait long. Later that afternoon, security called to report that Amira Johnson had been spotted trying to enter the base through a maintenance gate. She'd been stopped before getting through, but she was currently sitting in the security office, refusing to leave until she spoke with someone about her mother's belongings. "Send her to my office," Whitaker ordered. Then to Perez, "You'd better stay. Something tells me we're going to need all the help we can get." When Amira was escorted in 20 minutes later, she looked defiant despite the obvious nervousness in her eyes. She clutched a worn backpack to her chest, and Whitaker could see the edge of an envelope peeking out from the top. "Miss Johnson," he said, his voice gentler than it had been yesterday. "You're persistent, I'll give you that." "I need to get into my mother's old locker," Amira said without preamble. "Locker 247 in the engineering section. She left something there for me." Whitaker exchanged a glance with Perez. "And how do you know that?" In response, Amira pulled out the envelope and placed it on his desk. "Because she told me. In this letter. The one she wrote before she died on your mission." The Admiral's hand shook slightly as he reached for the envelope. He recognized Naomi's handwriting immediately, and the sight of it was like a knife to the chest. He read through the letter slowly, his face growing paler with each line. When he finished, he set it down carefully and looked at Amira, with eyes that glistened suspiciously. "She saved my life," he said hoarsely. "I never told anyone that part. It wasn't in the official report, but she stayed behind in the engine room, manually containing the meltdown while we evacuated. By the time we realized she wasn't with us, it was too late to go back." "She knew," Amira said, her own voice thick with emotion. "She knew what would happen. That's why she left me the letter and the ring and taught me about the ships. She wanted me to understand." Perez stepped forward. "Sir, if there are corrected schematics in that locker, they could be important. Commander Johnson's work shouldn't be lost." Whitaker nodded slowly. He'd spent 5 years trying to forget, to move past his guilt, to pretend that Naomi Johnson's death had been an unavoidable tragedy rather than a preventable disaster. But looking at her daughter's determined face, seeing the intelligence and courage that so clearly came from Naomi herself, he realized that forgetting had never been an option. "All right," he said finally. "But we do this properly. Lieutenant Perez, you'll accompany us to the engineering section. We'll open the locker together, and whatever we find, we document it officially. And if what we find contradicts the official story," Perez asked carefully. "Then we deal with that when it happens," Whitaker replied. He stood, squaring his shoulders as if preparing for battle. "Miss Johnson, your mother was one of the finest officers I ever served with. It's past time we acknowledge that properly." The walk to the engineering section felt surreal to Amira. Now she wasn't sneaking or being escorted as an intruder. She was walking beside an admiral and a lieutenant, with sailors stepping aside respectfully to let them pass. Some of the crew recognized her from yesterday's demonstration, and she could see the curiosity in their eyes. The engineering section was deep in the ship's belly, a maze of pipes and machinery that hummed with constant activity. The locker room was smaller than Amira expected, with rows of gray metal lockers lining the walls. Many had names stenciled on them in white paint. Locker 247 was in the back corner, and Naomi Johnson's name was still visible, though faded with time. "It should have been cleared out after she died," Perez observed quietly. "It was supposed to be," Whitaker said, "but I ordered it sealed instead. I couldn't bring myself to have her things thrown away or sent home. It seemed like destroying evidence of her existence." The locker had a combination lock, but the letter had included the code. Amira's fingers found the numbers easily, muscle memory from watching her mother open similar locks hundreds of times in her memories. The lock clicked open. Inside, the locker was mostly empty. A spare uniform hung neatly on a hook. A pair of work boots sat on the bottom shelf. But on the top shelf, wrapped in a waterproof bag, was a tablet computer and a sealed folder. Perez carefully retrieved both items and placed them on a nearby work table. The tablet powered on when he pressed the button, and the screen showed a simple menu with various files labeled with technical names. But it was the folder that made everyone's breath catch. Inside were detailed engineering schematics, calculations, test results, and a comprehensive report outlining every flaw in the Seahawk engine design. There were also Naomi's handwritten notes documenting her conversations with Whitaker and other superior officers, her repeated warnings about the risks, and her recommendations for fixes that had been ignored. "This is evidence," Perez said quietly. "Evidence that Commander Johnson tried to stop the test. Evidence that her concerns were dismissed." Whitaker stared at the documents, his face ashen. "This could end my career, possibly result in court-martial proceedings. Or it could clear her name," Amira said fiercely. "Everyone thinks she made a mistake, that something went wrong with her design. But this proves she was right. She tried to save everyone, and they wouldn't listen." The Admiral closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, there was a resignation in them that spoke of a man finally accepting his fate. "You're right. She deserves better than what we gave her, better than silence and classified files." "Sir, what are you saying?" Perez asked, though he already knew. "I'm saying we're going to do what Naomi wanted. We're going to finish her work properly." Whitaker turned to Amira. "Your mother's design wasn't flawed. It was revolutionary. But it needed refinements, adjustments that we never gave her time to implement. These schematics show exactly what needed to be fixed." He picked up one of the technical drawings, studying it with the eye of someone who'd spent decades working with naval engineering. "If we could implement these corrections, prove that her design works, it would vindicate her completely." "Can we do that?" Amira asked, her heart racing. "Not alone," Whitaker admitted, "but with the right people, the right resources." He trailed off, thinking. Then his expression hardened with determination. "The ship is scheduled for a short demonstration voyage next week. Just a routine run. But if we could use that time to test the corrected system, to prove it works." "That's incredibly risky, sir," Perez said. "If anything goes wrong, then I'll take full responsibility." Whitaker interrupted. "But nothing will go wrong because this time we're going to do it right. We're going to follow Naomi's instructions to the letter." He turned to Amira, and for the first time since they'd met, he smiled at her with genuine warmth. "You have her gift, Amira. You proved that yesterday, and I'm going to need your help to finish what she started. Are you willing?" Amira didn't hesitate. "Yes, sir." "Good." Whitaker began gathering the documents. "Lieutenant Perez, I'll need you to assemble a small team of engineers we can trust. People who knew Commander Johnson, who respected her work. We have 1 week to make this happen." As they prepared to leave the locker room, Amira paused and looked back at her mother's name on the locker door. She touched it gently, tracing the faded letters. "We're going to make them remember you, Mom," she whispered. "I promise." Behind her, Admiral Whitaker heard the words and felt something shift in his chest. For 5 years, he'd carried his guilt like a weight, letting it drag him down, using it as punishment for his failures. But maybe guilt wasn't meant to be carried forever. Maybe it was meant to be transformed into action, into redemption, into doing better. "Lieutenant," he said as they walked back through the ship's corridors, "I want you to know that I'm putting both our careers at risk with this. If you want to step back, I'll understand." Perez shook his head. "Sir, with respect, Commander Johnson died trying to do the right thing. The least we can do is finish her work. I'm in." Whitaker nodded, gratitude and respect evident in his expression. "Then let's get to work. We have an engine to build and a legacy to honor." The next several days passed in a blur of activity. Whitaker quietly assembled his team, bringing in engineers who'd worked with Naomi and who understood what they were trying to achieve. Each one was shown the schematics, read the letter, and asked to keep everything confidential. Each one agreed without hesitation. Amira became a fixture in the engineering bay, studying her mother's designs and offering insights that surprised even the veteran engineers. She had an intuitive understanding of the systems, a way of seeing problems and solutions that reminded everyone of Naomi herself. "It's like having Johnson back," one gray-haired chief engineer commented to Perez. "The kid thinks just like her." "She was trained by the best," Perez replied, watching Amira explain a modification to a skeptical lieutenant who'd asked a question. Within minutes, the lieutenant was nodding along, convinced. But not everything was going smoothly. Word of the unusual activity had started to spread, and questions were being asked. The base commander called Whitaker in for a meeting, demanding to know why so many resources were being devoted to what was supposed to be a routine demonstration voyage. "Just some upgrades, sir," Whitaker said smoothly. "Maintenance improvements that are overdue. Nothing to worry about." The commander gave him a long, searching look. "Thomas, we've known each other a long time. If you're planning something that's going to come back on me, I'd appreciate a heads up." "It won't come back on you," Whitaker promised. "Whatever happens, it's on me alone." That seemed to satisfy the commander, though his expression remained concerned as Whitaker left his office. The night before the demonstration voyage, Amira stood on the carrier's deck, looking out at the dark water. The air was cool, carrying the salt smell she'd come to associate with her mother's world. Somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, was the spot where Naomi had made her final stand, where she'd given everything to save others. "Couldn't sleep," Perez's voice came from behind her. She shook her head. "Too nervous. What if something goes wrong tomorrow? What if we can't make it work? Then we'll deal with it," he said, coming to stand beside her at the railing. "But I don't think it will go wrong. Your mother was brilliant and her design is sound. We've checked every calculation 3 times. "Lieutenant," Amira said quietly, "why are you helping me? You didn't know my mom. You could get in trouble for this." Perez was silent for a moment, staring out at the water. "My father was an engineer too," he finally said. "He worked on bridges, not ships, but the principle is the same. He always told me that engineering isn't just about math and physics. It's about responsibility. Every calculation you make, every design you create, people's lives depend on it. Your mother understood that. She took that responsibility seriously enough to die for it. That's the kind of officer I want to be." Amira felt tears prick her eyes. "She would have liked you." "I wish I could have known her," Perez replied. "But getting to know you, seeing her work through your eyes, has been an honor." They stood together in companionable silence, watching the stars reflect on the dark water, each lost in their own thoughts about the day ahead. In his quarters, Admiral Whitaker sat at his desk, writing. If things went wrong tomorrow, if the test failed, or if the Navy decided to punish him for his unauthorized modifications, he wanted a record of the truth. He wrote about Naomi's warnings, about his decision to override her concerns, about her sacrifice and his guilt. He wrote about Amira's courage and determination, about how a 10-year-old girl had shown more integrity than most of the officers he'd served with. And he wrote about redemption, about the possibility that mistakes, even deadly ones, could be transformed into something meaningful if you had the courage to face them honestly. When he finished, he sealed the letter in an envelope addressed to the Secretary of the Navy and placed it in his desk drawer. Then he changed into his uniform, made sure everything was in order, and tried to get a few hours of sleep before the most important day of his naval career. Tomorrow, they would honor Naomi Johnson's memory properly. Tomorrow, they would prove that her brilliance hadn't died with her. Tomorrow, one way or another, the truth would come out. The carrier waited in the darkness, its engines quiet, its secrets ready to be revealed. Somewhere in its mechanical heart, Naomi's corrected design had been installed, checked, and prepared. It was ready for its moment of vindication. All they had to do was make it work. The demonstration voyage began at dawn, with the carrier slipping out of Norfolk Harbor like a steel giant waking from sleep. Amira stood on the command deck, wearing a visitor's badge that Lieutenant Perez had secured for her, her mother's cap firmly on her head. The morning air was crisp and salty, carrying the promise of the open ocean. Around her, sailors moved with practiced efficiency, preparing the ship for what they believed would be a routine exercise. But nothing about today was routine. Admiral Whitaker stood at the helm, his face composed but his eyes betraying the tension he felt. The corrected Seahawk engine had been installed in one of the auxiliary systems, a safer approach than the full-scale implementation that had doomed the original test. If it worked, they'd have proof of Naomi's genius. If it failed, well, at least they'd tried. "All stations report ready, sir," the communications officer announced. Whitaker nodded. "Take us out. Standard course, 20 knots." The carrier moved smoothly through the water, its massive bulk cutting through the waves with deceptive grace. Amira watched the coastline recede, feeling a mixture of excitement and dread. Somewhere out there was the place where her mother had died. Somewhere in these same waters, Naomi Johnson had made her final stand. "You okay?" Perez asked quietly, appearing at her side. Just thinking about her, Amira replied, wondering if she knew when she got up that last morning that she wouldn't come home. I think she knew the risks, Perez said. All good engineers do. But she went anyway because she believed in what she was doing. 3 hours into the voyage, with the coast far behind, them and nothing but open water in every direction, Whitaker gave the order they'd all been waiting for. Lieutenant Perez, begin the Seahawk test sequence. The engineering team sprang into action, their movements coordinated from weeks of preparation. Amira moved to the auxiliary control station where her mother's design was about to be put to the test. Her hands trembled slightly as she entered the initial startup codes, the same ones Naomi had taught her years ago. Primary systems coming online, one engineer reported. Power flow stable. Temperature within normal range, another added. No anomalies detected. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. Each reading was checked, double-checked, verified against Naomi's calculations. The engine hummed steadily, its sound growing stronger but never erratic, never showing the instability that had plagued the original design. It's working, Perez said, his voice filled with wonder. It's actually working. Whitaker allowed himself a small smile. Of course it is. Naomi Johnson never made mistakes. We were the ones who... The alarm cut through his words like a siren. Red lights flashed across the command deck as every screen suddenly showed the same warning. An unidentified contact had appeared on radar, approaching fast from the east. The celebration died instantly, replaced by military precision as sailors rushed to their stations. Contact bearing 090, range 12 miles and closing. The radar operator called out. Speed 30 knots. No transponder signal. Visual, Whitaker demanded. Nothing yet, sir. There's fog rolling in from that direction. Amira felt her stomach clench. Something about this felt wrong, felt too coincidental. They were in the middle of their test, at the exact location where her mother's mission had failed, and now an unidentified vessel was approaching. All stop, Whitaker ordered. Battle stations, but hold fire. Let's see what we're dealing with. The carrier slowed, its engines winding down to idle. The Seahawk test was put on hold, though the system remained active, humming quietly in the background. Everyone's attention turned to the radar screen and the mysterious contact growing steadily closer. The fog came first, rolling across the water like a gray blanket, thick and unnatural for this time of year. It moved with purpose, as if summoned by some unseen force. The temperature dropped noticeably, and sailors on deck shivered despite their heavy jackets. Visibility dropped to less than 100 yards, turning the bright morning into a twilight gloom. Then, emerging from the mist like a ghost from a forgotten nightmare, came the ship. It was smaller than the carrier, old and battered, sitting dangerously low in the water. Rust streaked its hull in patterns that looked almost like blood, and sections of the superstructure looked damaged, as if from fire or explosion. Pieces of railing hung loose, swaying with the gentle motion of the waves. The deck was littered with debris, and seawater washed across it with each small swell. Despite all this damage, despite looking like it should have sunk years ago, the vessel remained stubbornly afloat. But what made everyone freeze, what made the blood drain from every face on the command deck, was the designation painted on its bow, barely visible through the corrosion and decay. N.A.J. Naomi A. Johnson, Perez breathed, reading the letters aloud. Amira's world tilted. Her mother's ship. The research vessel from Operation Seahawk, the one that was supposed to have sunk 5 years ago. Yet here it was, drifting toward them through impossible fog, transmitting a signal that shouldn't exist. "Sir, that's not possible," the communications officer said, his voice shaking. "That ship was lost with all hands. It's been on the bottom of the Atlantic for 5 years. Check the signal again." Whitaker ordered, though his face had gone pale. "Tell me exactly what frequency it's using." Sir, it's a repeating pattern on an old Navy frequency, one that hasn't been in use for over a decade. The pattern repeats every 10 seconds. Amira stepped closer to the communications station, listening to the signal through the speakers. It was a series of tones, seemingly random, but something about them nagged at her memory. Her mother used to whistle while she worked, a habit that had driven everyone crazy but that Amira had loved. "That's her pattern," Amira said suddenly. "My mom used to whistle that exact sequence when she was fixing engines. She said it helped her think." The command deck went silent. Everyone stared at the derelict ship, at the impossible signal, at the little girl whose dead mother seemed to be calling to them from beyond the grave. "That's impossible," Whitaker said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Naomi is dead. I saw the explosion. I searched for survivors." "Then how do you explain the signal?" Perez asked. "How do you explain that ship?" "I can't," Whitaker admitted. "But we need to investigate. That vessel shouldn't be here, and if there's any chance—" He trailed off, unable to voice the hope that someone might have survived. "Sir, I strongly advise against approaching," the tactical officer said. "It could be a trap. The ship might be rigged or booby-trapped, or it might contain answers," Whitaker countered. He turned to Perez. "Lieutenant, assemble a boarding team. I want that ship searched thoroughly, and I'm going with you." "Sir, you can't." Several officers protested simultaneously. "I can and I will," Whitaker said firmly. "That ship went down under my command. If there's anything left, if there's any evidence of what really happened, I need to see it myself." "I'm going too," Amira said, her voice small but determined. "Absolutely not," Whitaker said immediately. "You're a civilian and a child. This is too dangerous." "She was my mother," Amira insisted, "and if she left something on that ship, if there's a message or a clue, I might be the only one who can recognize it. You need me." Whitaker wanted to refuse, every instinct telling him to keep the girl safe. But he saw the determination in her eyes, the same iron will that Naomi had possessed. And perhaps she was right. Perhaps they did need her. "She stays behind me at all times," he finally said. "And if I say run, you run. Understood?" "Yes, sir," Amira agreed quickly before he could change his mind. Within 20 minutes, a boarding party of 6 was ready. Whitaker, Perez, Amira, 2 security personnel, and a damage control specialist. They boarded a small launch and motored across the gap between the carrier and the derelict, the fog so thick they could barely see either ship despite the short distance. Up close, the research vessel looked even worse. The hull was covered in marine growth, sections of railing had collapsed, and scorch marks blackened the superstructure. It listed slightly to port, and water sloshed across the deck with each small wave. It was a miracle the ship was still afloat. "Looks like it's been drifting for years," the damage control specialist observed as they climbed aboard. "I'm surprised it hasn't broken up." The deck was slippery and treacherous, covered in algae and rust. They moved carefully toward the main hatch, which stood partially open. Inside, the corridor was dark and filled with the smell of salt water and decay. Their flashlights cut through the gloom, revealing overturned equipment, water-damaged walls, and debris scattered everywhere. "The signal is coming from the bridge," Perez said, checking a handheld tracker. "This way." They moved in single file, weapons drawn despite the apparent abandonment of the ship. Every sound made them jump. Water dripping, metal creaking, their own footsteps echoing in the confined space. The ship felt haunted, filled with the ghosts of those who died here. Amira's hand found the Naval Academy ring hanging around her neck, clutching it for courage. She tried to imagine her mother walking these same corridors, working in these same spaces, never knowing that her last mission would end in tragedy. The bridge was in better condition than the rest of the ship, though still showing severe damage from the explosion that had nearly destroyed the vessel. The main console was dark except for one panel that glowed with dim emergency power, broadcasting the signal they'd detected. "There," Perez said, pointing to the console. "That's the source." Whitaker approached carefully, examining the setup. Someone had rigged the emergency beacon to broadcast on a specific frequency, using what little power remained in the ship's backup systems. It was an impressive feat of engineering, especially for someone who'd been injured or dying. "Look at this," the damage control specialist said from across the bridge. He was pointing at the wall where Naomi's name was etched into the metal, along with a date. The day of the disaster. Amir touched the letters gently, her fingers tracing the crude carving. "She was here," she whispered, "after the explosion. She survived long enough to do this." "There's more," Perez said, his voice strange. He was crouched beside the captain's chair, reaching into a sealed compartment underneath. When he stood, he held a waterproof capsule, the kind designed to protect documents from water damage. The label read, "For command only," in Naomi's handwriting. Whitaker took the capsule with shaking hands. Inside was a portable hard drive and a handwritten note. The note was brief. "Tom, if you're reading this, you came back. Thank you. The drive contains everything, including what really caused the meltdown. I tried to fix it alone. I failed. I'm sorry. Tell Amira I love her. Tell her she was right to believe in me. NJ." The Admiral's face crumpled. He'd spent 5 years believing Naomi had died in the initial explosion, never knowing she'd survived long enough to document everything, to leave a message, to wait for rescue that never came. "We have to get this back to the carrier," he said roughly. "We need to see what's on that drive." But before they could move, the ship lurched violently. Alarms began blaring from the carrier's direction, barely audible through the fog. The communications officer's voice crackled over their radios, panicked and urgent. "Admiral, we have a problem. The Seahawk engine is showing instability, temperature spiking rapidly. We need you back here now." "Shut it down," Whitaker ordered. "We're trying, sir, but the system isn't responding. It's like the original test all over again." Amira's blood went cold. The signal, the derelict ship, the timing of it all. Her mother had known this would happen. She'd known the corrected design was still missing something, some crucial element that only became apparent under specific conditions. "We have to get back," Perez said urgently. "If that engine melts down." "Everyone move," Whitaker ordered. They ran through the corridors, the ship groaning and listing further as if it too sensed the urgency. Behind them, deep in the carrier's engineering section, Naomi's engine design was failing, just as the original had, following the same pattern, heading toward the same catastrophic conclusion. They reached the launch and pushed off, the small boat racing across the water toward the carrier. Through the fog, they could see red emergency lights flashing across the massive vessel's superstructure. Smoke was beginning to rise from somewhere deep inside. "How much time do we have?" Whitaker demanded over the radio. 5 minutes, maybe less," came the reply. "We're evacuating non-essential personnel." They reached the carrier and scrambled aboard, racing toward the engineering section. The corridors were filled with sailors moving in organized chaos, following emergency protocols drilled into them through countless exercises. But this wasn't a drill. In the engineering bay, the scene was controlled pandemonium. Engineers worked frantically at control panels, trying to override the failing system. The Seahawk engine itself was visible through reinforced glass, glowing ominously, its temperature readings far into the red zone. "Report!" Whitaker barked. The chief engineer looked up, his face streaked with sweat. "It's cascading, sir, just like last time. We tried the shutdown sequence, but it's not responding. Something in the design, some feedback loop we didn't catch." "The drive," Amira said suddenly, pulling out the waterproof capsule. My mother's last recording. She said she tried to fix it alone. Maybe she figured out what was wrong. Perez grabbed the drive and plugged it into the nearest computer. Files appeared on screen, dozens of them, all dated from the day of the original disaster. Video logs, technical analyses, calculations. He opened the most recent video file. Naomi's face appeared on screen, haggard and smoke-stained, but her eyes were still sharp with intelligence. The video had been recorded in what looked like the derelict ship's engine room, with sparks and flames visible in the background. "If anyone finds this," she began, her voice hoarse, "then you've probably made the same mistake I did. The design works. But there's a resonance frequency in the cooling system that creates a feedback loop under sustained load. You can't just shut it down. The shutdown itself triggers the cascade. The only way to stop it is to flood the chamber with coolant while simultaneously routing power through the emergency bypass to prevent pressure buildup." She coughed, her face tight with pain. "It requires manual activation from inside the chamber. The radiation exposure will be lethal. I tried it, but the damage was already too severe. I couldn't complete the sequence." The video ended abruptly. Everyone in the engineering bay stood frozen, processing what they'd just heard. Naomi had identified the problem and the solution, but she'd died before she could implement it. And now they faced the same choice she had. Someone had to go into that chamber. "I'll do it," Whitaker said immediately. "This is my fault. I should have died 5 years ago. Naomi saved me then. Now it's my turn." "Sir, you can't," Perez started. "That's an order, Lieutenant," Whitaker said firmly. He began putting on a radiation suit, his movements deliberate and calm despite the ticking clock. "Someone needs to survive to tell the story, to make sure Naomi gets credit for her work. That someone is you." "Admiral," Amira said, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for believing in her, for finishing what she started." Whitaker knelt in front of her, placing his hands on her shoulders. His eyes were clear, filled with a peace that hadn't been there before. The guilt that had haunted him for 5 years seemed to have finally released its grip. "Your mother was the best engineer I ever knew, and the bravest person I ever met. She understood that some things are worth dying for, worth sacrificing everything to protect the people who depend on you. She saved my life once, pulled me out of that engine room when I was too stubborn to save myself. The least I can do is save yours now, save this crew, save everyone who would suffer if we failed." He touched the Naval Academy ring hanging around her neck. "You're going to do great things, Amira Johnson. Greater than your mother. Greater than me. Make sure everyone knows what she accomplished. Make sure her name is remembered with honor." He stood and entered the chamber through the emergency access hatch, the heavy door sealing behind him with a final, ominous clang. Through the reinforced glass, they could see him moving among the glowing components, following Naomi's instructions from memory. The engine pulsed with dangerous light, casting strange shadows across his face. He reached the coolant controls and began the flooding sequence, his movements deliberate despite the chaos surrounding him. "Routing power to emergency bypass," he reported over the comm system, his voice steady. The engine's glow intensified, becoming almost too bright to look at. Alarms screamed. Temperature readings spiked higher. Then Whitaker activated the final sequence, his hands moving quickly despite the bulky suit and the radiation that must have been cooking him from the inside. There was a moment where everything seemed to hang in balance, where the entire ship held its breath. The engine's glow began to fade. Temperature readings dropped. The cascade reversed itself, the feedback loop broken by Whitaker's intervention. Within seconds, the system was stabilizing, returning to safe parameters. But when they opened the chamber, they found Admiral Thomas Whitaker collapsed beside the controls, his radiation badge black with exposure. He was unconscious but still breathing, barely. "Get medical down here now," Perez shouted. Medics arrived within minutes, stabilizing Whitaker and rushing him to sickbay. Amira followed, refusing to leave his side. She held his hand as they worked on him, as doctors grimly assessed the radiation damage, as everyone waited to see if he would survive his act of redemption. Hours later, in the medical bay, Whitaker opened his eyes to find Amira sitting beside his bed. Lieutenant Perez stood nearby, along with several other officers and crew members who'd gathered to pay their respects. "Did it work?" Whitaker asked, his voice weak. "You saved the ship," Perez confirmed. "The engine stabilized. Your mother's design works, Amira. She was right about everything." Whitaker smiled faintly. "Of course she was." He turned to look at Amira. "I'm sorry I didn't listen to her. I'm sorry it took me 5 years to make things right." "You saved us," Amira said, squeezing his hand gently. "Just like she saved you. That makes you even." "Tell me," Whitaker said, looking at Perez. "The hard drive. What else was on it?" "Complete documentation of the original test, sir. Video evidence of Commander Johnson warning against proceeding. Proof that she tried to stop it and was overruled. Everything we need to clear her name officially." "Good," Whitaker said. "That's good." His eyes started to close, exhaustion pulling him under. But before he drifted off, he whispered, "She never blamed me. She saved my life knowing I'd ignored her warnings. That's courage." The doctors had said his prognosis was uncertain. The radiation exposure was severe. But he'd survived the initial crisis, and now it was just a matter of time and his body's resilience. As the sun set outside the ship's portholes, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Amira sat beside the Admiral and thought about sacrifice, about redemption, about the way courage could echo across years and generations. Her mother had died trying to save others. Admiral Whitaker had nearly died finishing her work. And somehow, in the intersection of those two acts of bravery, truth had emerged. Lieutenant Perez entered quietly. "The preliminary reports are ready," he said softly. "Everything is documented. Your mother will get the recognition she deserves." Amira nodded slowly. Justice, it seemed, was finally arriving. And somehow, through it all, the truth had finally emerged. Naomi Johnson's brilliance would no longer be buried in classified files. Her sacrifice would be recognized. Her daughter would make sure of it. Outside, the derelict ship still drifted in the fog, its mission complete. It had carried its secrets across 5 years and countless miles, waiting for the right moment to reveal them. Now, like a ghost finally laid to rest, it began to sink, slipping quietly beneath the waves as if Naomi herself had been waiting to see her work vindicated before letting go. The carrier turned for home, carrying survivors, heroes, and the truth. The legacy had been reclaimed. The secret was secret no more. The carrier limped back into Norfolk Naval Base 3 days later, arriving not to the routine indifference of a standard return, but to a crowd of media, military brass, and curious onlookers who'd heard whispers of something extraordinary. The dock was packed with people, more than Amira had ever seen gathered in one place. News helicopters circled overhead, their cameras trained on the massive vessel as it approached. Reporters jostled for position behind security barriers, clutching microphones and notepads. Word had leaked, as it always does in the military, and the story of a 10-year-old girl, a dead hero engineer, and an admiral's redemption had captured imaginations across the fleet and beyond. It was the kind of story that reminded people why they believed in heroes, why they still had faith in institutions that sometimes failed, but could also rise to greatness. Amira stood on the deck as the massive vessel glided into port, her mother's cap firmly on her head, the Naval Academy ring gleaming in the morning sun. The Virginia air was warm and humid, carrying the familiar scents of salt water and diesel fuel. She could see her grandmother in the crowd, standing apart from the officials and media, her hand pressed to her heart. Beside her, Lieutenant Perez stood at attention, his uniform crisp, despite the exhausting days they'd endured. His face showed the strain of what they'd been through, but also the quiet pride of someone who'd done the right thing despite the costs. Behind them, medical personnel prepared to transfer Admiral Whitaker, who remained in critical but stable condition, fighting off the effects of radiation poisoning, with the same stubborn determination he'd shown throughout his career. The gangway was barely in place before officials began boarding. The Secretary of the Navy himself had flown in from Washington, accompanied by a delegation of high-ranking officers and civilian observers. This wasn't just a routine debriefing. This was history being documented in real time. But before any official proceedings could begin, the crew had their own moment. As Amira and Perez helped guide the stretcher carrying Admiral Whitaker down to the dock, every sailor on deck snapped to attention. A salute rippled through the assembled crew, hundreds of men and women honoring the admiral who'd sacrificed himself for them, and the little girl who'd helped uncover the truth. "Look at that," Whitaker murmured weakly from his stretcher, his eyes glistening. "They're saluting you too, Amira." "They're saluting my mom," Amira replied, her voice thick with emotion. "Through me." At the dock, Amira's grandmother waited, her face a mixture of relief, worry, and fierce pride. She pulled Amira into a crushing embrace the moment she was within reach, holding on as if she'd never let go. "Child, you scared me half to death," she whispered, "but your mama would be so proud of you." "Grandma," Amira said, pulling back to look at her. "They're going to recognize her. They're going to tell everyone what she did." Her grandmother's eyes filled with tears. It's about time. The official proceedings began that afternoon in the base's largest conference room. Admiral Whitaker, against his doctor's advice but supported by enough medication to keep him conscious, insisted on attending. He sat in a wheelchair, looking frail but determined, with Amira standing beside him and Lieutenant Perez flanking his other side. The Secretary of the Navy, a distinguished man named Harold Brennan, called the room to order. Media cameras lined the back wall, recording everything. This would be broadcast across the nation, a story of tragedy transformed into triumph. "We are gathered here," Secretary Brennan began, "to address events that have remained classified for 5 years, and to honor individuals whose courage has finally come to light. 5 years ago, Lieutenant Commander Naomi Johnson gave her life during Operation Seahawk. For too long, her sacrifice has been hidden behind security classifications and incomplete information. Today, we change that." He proceeded to lay out the full story, reading from reports that included Naomi's warnings, her technical assessments, and the video evidence recovered from the derelict vessel. He explained how she'd identified the design flaws, how her concerns were overruled, how she'd stayed behind to save others when the disaster unfolded. "Lieutenant Commander Johnson was not only a brilliant engineer," Brennan continued, "but a hero of the highest caliber. She gave her life to protect her crew, and in doing so, she exemplified the very best of naval service." Amira listened as they described her mother in terms that finally matched the woman she remembered. Not a tragic casualty of an accident, but a hero who'd fought to prevent disaster and then sacrificed everything when prevention failed. "Furthermore," the Secretary said, "we must acknowledge the courage of Admiral Thomas Whitaker, who risked his life to complete Commander Johnson's work and save this crew from repeating that tragedy. And we must recognize Miss Amira Johnson, whose determination to honor her mother's memory has brought the truth to light." He paused, then gestured to an aide who brought forward a wooden case. "It is my honor to posthumously award Lieutenant Commander Naomi Johnson the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism. This medal represents the gratitude of a nation for her sacrifice and her service." The case was opened, revealing the Navy Cross nestled in blue velvet, Secretary Brennan lifted it carefully and approached Amira, kneeling to her level. "This belongs to your mother," he said gently, "and now it belongs to you, to hold in trust for her memory." Amira's hands shook as she accepted the medal. The weight of it was substantial, but it felt right, felt like finally getting to carry a piece of her mother home. Tears streamed down her face, but she smiled through them. "Thank you," she whispered. "She would have been honored." "No," Brennan corrected softly. "We are honored, by her and by you." He stood and turned to Admiral Whitaker. "Admiral, it is also my duty to commend you for your actions. You corrected a 5-year-old injustice and saved countless lives in the process. The Navy owes you a debt of gratitude." Whitaker tried to rise from his wheelchair, but Brennan waved him down. "Don't stand on my account, Tom. You've earned the right to rest." "Sir," Whitaker said, his voice raspy but clear, "I don't deserve commendation. I was the one who ignored Commander Johnson's warnings. I was the one whose arrogance led to her death. If anything, I deserve censure." "What you deserve," Brennan replied, "is recognition for having the courage to face your mistakes and make them right. That's not arrogance, Admiral. That's wisdom, hard-earned and costly. And it's why the President has approved your promotion to the rank of Admiral. 4 stars, effective immediately upon your recovery." The room erupted in applause. Whitaker looked stunned, overwhelmed. "Sir, I don't." "Accept it, Tom," Brennan said firmly. "You've earned it. And when you recover, we're going to need your expertise to implement Commander Johnson's engine design across the fleet. Her work will live on, making our ships better, safer, more efficient. That's the legacy she deserves." After the official ceremony, Lieutenant Perez was also recognized, promoted to lieutenant commander for his role in supporting the investigation and assisting during the crisis. He stood proudly as his new insignia was pinned on, and when it was done, he immediately walked over to Amira. "Your mother would be proud," he said, echoing her grandmother's words. "Not just of what you accomplished, but of who you are." "Thank you for believing in me," Amira replied, "for helping me find the truth." "I should thank you," Perez said. "You reminded me why I joined the Navy. To serve with honor, to seek truth, to stand up for what's right even when it's hard. Those are lessons I'll carry for the rest of my career." The media descended after the ceremony, wanting interviews, photographs, quotes. But Amira's grandmother, with the protective instinct of someone who'd raised a child through tragedy, shielded her from most of it. They gave one brief statement, expressing gratitude and honoring Naomi's memory, then retreated to privacy. That evening, in her grandmother's living room, Amira sat before the photograph that had started everything. But now it wasn't alone. Beside it sat the Navy Cross, gleaming in its case, and the official certificate recognizing Naomi Johnson's heroism. The envelope that had been hidden behind the frame now sat open on the mantel, its secrets revealed and honored. "She knew," Amira said quietly. "She knew they'd try to bury the truth, and she made sure there was a way to bring it back. Your mama was always 3 steps ahead of everyone," her grandmother said, settling into her chair. "She used to tell me that being a good engineer meant thinking about what could go wrong and planning for it. Guess she applied that to more than just engines." "Grandma," Amira asked, "do you think she'd want me to be an engineer too?" The old woman smiled. "Baby, your mama wanted you to be whatever made you happy. But I think she'd be pleased if you chose to follow in her footsteps. You've got her gift for it, that's clear enough." Amira touched the Naval Academy ring still hanging around her neck. An idea was forming, a dream that felt both terrifying and inevitable. But she had time. She was only 10. The Naval Academy could wait. For now, she had her mother's legacy to protect and honor. The weeks that followed brought more recognition. Naomi's photograph was added to the Naval Academy's Wall of Heroes, joining the ranks of distinguished graduates who'd given their lives in service. The citation beneath her image read, Lieutenant Commander Naomi Johnson, Naval Academy Class of 2015. Brilliant engineer, devoted mother, American hero. Her courage saved lives and her vision will guide the fleet for generations to come. Admiral Whitaker slowly recovered from his radiation exposure, defying the dire predictions of his doctors. He credited Amira's daily visits to the hospital, bringing updates about the implementation of her mother's designs and stories that made him laugh despite his pain. The bond between them deepened, becoming something like a grandfather and granddaughter, united by shared loss and hard-won redemption. 6 months after the incident, the carrier was officially recommissioned as the USS Naomi Johnson, an honor rarely bestowed on someone so young at their death. Amira was invited to christen the ship, breaking the ceremonial champagne bottle against its hull as cameras recorded the moment for history. "I christen thee USS Naomi Johnson," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the crowd. "May you sail with courage, serve with honor, and always seek the truth." The bottle shattered, foam cascading down the gray hull, and the crowd erupted in applause. Standing behind Amira, Admiral Whitaker saluted the ship that bore his friend's name, tears streaming unashamedly down his weathered face. But the true transformation came 5 years later. Amira stood in her room, now 15 years old, holding an envelope that had arrived that morning. Her hands trembled as she opened it, though she already knew what it would say. The Naval Academy seal embossed on the letterhead confirmed it. "Congratulations," the letter began. "We are pleased to inform you of your acceptance to the United States Naval Academy." She'd applied with Admiral Whitaker's recommendation, with transcripts that showed excellence in mathematics and physics, with essays that spoke of her mother's legacy and her own determination to serve. And now, against odds that would have seemed impossible 5 years ago, she'd been accepted. "Grandma," she called, racing down the stairs with the letter clutched in her hand. "Grandma, I got in." Her grandmother emerged from the kitchen, saw the letter, and immediately burst into tears. "Oh, baby. Oh, your mama would be so proud." They held each other, crying and laughing, celebrating a dream fulfilled and a circle completed. 4 years later, Amira Johnson stood at attention in the Naval Academy's graduation ceremony, now 19 years old, wearing the same uniform her mother had worn at her own graduation. The parallels weren't lost on anyone who'd known Naomi. Amira had her mother's bearing, her confidence, her way of standing, that suggested both strength and grace. The 4 years at the academy had been challenging, filled with early mornings, rigorous coursework, and the constant pressure to prove herself worthy of her mother's legacy. But she'd thrived, finding in the discipline and structure a way to channel her determination into achievement. The audience was packed with supporters, her grandmother, now elderly but still fierce, sitting in the front row with a tissue clutched in one hand and Naomi's photograph in the other. Lieutenant Commander Perez, who'd become a mentor throughout her academy years, visiting regularly and offering guidance when the pressures seemed overwhelming. And Admiral Whitaker, fully recovered and serving with distinction, sitting in a place of honor. His hair was whiter now, his face more lined, but his eyes held the same clarity and purpose they'd gained on that fateful voyage 9 years ago. The ceremony itself was steeped in tradition, each ritual carrying the weight of centuries of naval service. Speeches were delivered about duty, honor, and country. The graduating class sat in perfect rows, their faces reflecting a mixture of pride, relief, and anticipation for what came next. As the names were called alphabetically, Amira's heart raced. She thought about her mother sitting in a similar ceremony 24 years ago, accepting her own diploma, beginning a career that would end in tragedy, but also in heroism. When her turn came, She stepped forward with precise military bearing, every movement practiced and perfect. Midshipman Amira Johnson, the commandant announced, graduating with honors in naval engineering. She accepted her diploma, then turned to receive the Naval Academy ring that every graduate earned. But instead of the standard ceremony, Admiral Whitaker himself stood from his seat and walked onto the stage, carrying a small box. "Midshipman Johnson," he said formally, though his eyes sparkled with warmth, "it is my distinct privilege to present you with this ring." He opened the box, revealing not a new ring, but her mother's original Naval Academy ring, the one Amira had carried for 9 years. It had been carefully resized to fit her adult hand, the engraving preserved, the history maintained. "Your mother earned this ring through dedication and brilliance," Whitaker said. "You've earned the right to wear it through courage and perseverance. 2 generations, 1 legacy, forever united." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly. Amira's eyes blurred with tears, but she kept her composure, saluting sharply. "Thank you, sir." "No," Whitaker replied, returning the salute with equal precision. "Thank you for reminding us all what honor really means." The audience rose in a standing ovation, applause thundering through the hall. Amira stood there, her mother's ring on her finger, her own freshly earned diploma in her hand, and felt the weight of 9 years of determination, grief, and triumph settle into something new: purpose. After the ceremony, she stood with Admiral Whitaker and Commander Perez before a memorial that had been erected on Academy grounds. A bronze statue of Lieutenant Commander Naomi Johnson, captured in the moment of checking an engine schematic, standing tall and confident. The plaque beneath read, "For those who build and those who believe." "She'd be proud of you," Whitaker said quietly. "Tay, everything you've become, everything you're going to do. She'd be so incredibly proud." "I hope so," Amira replied, "because I'm not done yet. The Seahawk engine is operational, but there's more to improve, more to discover. Mom's work opened doors. I'm going to walk through them." "That's the spirit," Perez said with a grin. "The fleet needs good engineers, needs people who aren't afraid to speak truth to power. People like my mother," Amira said firmly. "People who understand that doing the right thing matters more than following orders blindly." As the sun set over the Academy grounds, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Amira lifted her hand, watching the light catch her mother's ring. The engraving was worn but still legible, a testament to years of service and sacrifice. She thought about that first day on the carrier, when she'd been just a 10-year-old girl with a cap and a ring and a determination to understand. She thought about all the people who'd helped her along the way, who'd believed in her when she had no right to expect belief. And she thought about the future, about the career ahead of her, about the ships she'd improve and the lives she'd protect through her engineering. Her mother's legacy had been reclaimed from classified files and official silence. Now it was Amira's responsibility to carry it forward, to build on that foundation, to prove that courage and brilliance could be inherited and amplified. "Ready to change the world, Ensign Johnson?" Whitaker asked, using her new rank. Amira smiled, her mother's smile, confident and warm. "Yes, sir. I've been ready since I was 10 years old, standing on that carrier deck, proving to everyone that I belonged." They walked together across the Academy grounds, 3 generations of naval service united by tragedy, redeemed by truth, and committed to a future where heroes like Naomi Johnson would never be forgotten. The carrier bearing her name sailed somewhere on distant waters, powered by her genius, protected by her sacrifice. And her daughter, wearing her ring and carrying her legacy, was ready to write the next chapter of that story. The dawn of a new generation had arrived, built on the foundations of the past, reaching toward a future bright with promise. Some engines are built from steel, Admiral Whitaker had once said. Others from heart. Either way, when they ignite, the world moves forward. Amira Johnson's engine was just beginning to roar to life. If you had to choose between protecting your reputation and honoring someone's sacrifice, which would you pick? And could you live with that choice? Like and subscribe for more stories about courage, redemption, and the truths we're afraid to face.